Hello, brothers. This has been Robinson, and we're going to spend some time today with Rob Caudill, who's the executive director of the fraternity, as you know. And over the last several months, I've gotten a number of questions from brothers. And, I thought, well, heck, we'll go on video and we'll answer the brothers' questions. But I said, well, let's get the person who's going to have the most up-to-date answers and going to be the most knowledgeable about that. And that's Rob. And so we have Rob on today. And there are a series of questions that I have that we're going to give to Rob, and he's going to answer them. And he's also going to throw in anything else that he wants to share with you to keep you informed about what's happening in Phi Gamma Delta. And so we're going to try to keep this to about 25 minutes. And we're just going to go ahead and jump right in. Rob, if that's okay with you, let's go ahead and get started.
Absolutely, Ben.
Hey, this has been a rather crazy year, and it's been a disruptive year. And really, I think one of the questions that I've gotten the most from brothers is, so how is the fraternity doing? And so, Rob, share with us what you know and what you want to share.
Sure. Well, I think first of all, Ben, I would say that overall Phi Gamma Delta remains strong. Yes, the last 8 months in particular have been very challenging for us, but it's amazing to see how many brothers, how many chapters have really risen to some very significant challenges and have made some very, very real adaptations to keep us pressing forward. I think most brothers are pretty well aware that in terms of undergraduate chapters, things are very different right now. The men on our campuses are facing just a different set of scenarios where they're not in their traditional classroom settings. A lot of them are doing online classes. Now, the good news is that most of them, not all, but most are still on campus in some way, even if they aren't in class in person. Some of them have some different models, but generally speaking, a lot of our undergraduates are back on campus. And I think that's something they were really looking forward to. One of the things that's very different for undergraduates is just campus life today. Yeah, you just don't see those big gatherings. We can't do them. There's a lot of rules and a lot of restrictions in place, and those of course vary by location, by state, by city, by province. And so there's a lot of different challenges that each of our chapters are facing. Generally speaking, those big events, as I alluded to, that we're used to, just aren't happening. A lot of those in-person gatherings are limited to 10 people or 25 people in some cases. So you just don't have things like those big recruitment events or those big welcome weekends that we're used to in the fall. Recruitment looked very different this year for a myriad of reasons, and even down to chapters being able to meet. In many cases, they cannot meet in person. They're just too big to have that many people in one room. So they're having to leverage a lot of technology to get there. I mean, the good news is, again, that our chapters in the fraternity whole have made a lot of very real adaptations, and I think are finding ways to do it well and to do it right. There's been some hiccups along the way and a lot of learning curves, but overall, Phi Gamma Delta remains fairly strong. We'd certainly be in a better position without the impact of COVID-19 among us, but we're dealing with it, and I think we're all working together to answer the question of what happens next.
Yeah, I have heard in talking to some undergraduate brothers that when they got to school, obviously at the beginning of the semester, they really wanted to come back and have it as it was in the past, kind of keep going. And then they found out that they couldn't do that because some brothers were getting sick. So I guess another big question that I've gotten is, the kind of how are our undergraduates doing as far as kind of their overall health, and just kind of, we know that some of them have had COVID, but what are you kind of hearing and seeing about that?
Overall, I think we're fortunate that our population of undergraduate men are generally young and healthy. And so the symptoms that they've experienced and the overall health impact of COVID has seemed to be minimal on those brothers. We know some number of brothers in chapter houses and elsewhere who have been tested positive and have been under quarantine orders. But overall, in terms of their health, I've not heard of anyone on the undergraduate side who has faced those real challenges. Now, I think the one piece to point out is, as you started to say, they all want to come back and go back to normal. And so there was a bit of a learning curve on a lot of campuses for how that was going to go. So those first 3 weeks of the school year, especially, we saw a lot of issues rise brought up with campuses about student behavior. And in some cases, chapters had to learn that the hard way. So we've got some number of chapters facing some disciplinary action. Either it's already been taken or it's pending, either from the fraternity or from their campus. We're not following those guidelines, which we are very strong about. So we've lost a couple chapters too. We don't want to sugarcoat that. We've had 2 colonies that, as they returned just without the amount of in-person activity that they really needed to get their organization back up and running again after a quick stop in the spring. It just wasn't there, and they just couldn't materialize. So we know that there could be some more losses, but overall, our chapters as a whole appear to be responding pretty well.
You know, and you and I have talked about this, and I even kind of joke around about it, but in a very positive way, is that, you know, our undergraduates are very creative. They undergraduate men have always been creative, and I have heard, you know, that they've really kind of risen to the occasion in so many ways in this. And I mean, are you finding that to be true? And if you can, just share a couple things that might be going on that we need to know about. And I want to later, in regard to that too, I want to ask you about recruitment, and it might just lead into that as well. So,
well, you know, the good news is maybe one good byproduct of this COVID pandemic is that we found a way to channel some of that creativity, right? And so I think in a lot of ways that they've done good work to find new ways to accomplish the results they want to see. So in terms of recruitment and having to go virtual, a lot of chapters have seen good results there. In terms of shifting their philanthropies and some of their service, I think the chapters have seen good opportunities, both in the traditional sense, to still provide that in-person community service where it's desperately needed right now, in some very important areas, as well as shifting some of their planned events so that they can get that broader reach on a virtual platform. So I think everything from those to, I think a lot of graduates were bummed out they didn't get to go to a pig dinner this past spring, but we've seen a lot of good work, both from undergraduates and graduates, to keep graduates and undergraduates connected in a lot of different ways. So we have seen some positives come out of this.
you know, one of the other big questions that I've heard from graduate brothers is how are we going to recruit? You know, how is that going to happen? And, you know, I've heard that some of our chapters have had, this is one of their best years that they've had as far as recruiting and as far as numbers go. I'm curious about how they're doing it and why we may be having see those numbers go up, but also talk a little bit about the fraternity's expansion to some new campuses. And I mean, this is happening when schools are kind of like, you know, half closed and half open. So share those three kind of things with us, please.
Well, in terms of how it does look a little bit different place to place, but the piece that remains through all is they're getting back to the basics. Our chapters are really getting back to the basics of recruitment, in getting to know men in one-on-one settings and in small group settings, oftentimes in virtual settings as well. These kind of conversations over Zoom or Google Hangouts or the like, where they can really get to know those potential members in a very different way, but in a very important way, because they are getting to know them individually as opposed to showcasing a big chapter house or showing a social calendar. We've got some, you know, to your point, some chapters are having their best year ever. One of the byproducts of all this is the recruitment process is very different. As I mentioned, you know, there is no big formal recruitment taking place on most campuses, or where it is, it just is very different. It doesn't have quite the same impact. So a lot of ways we're seeing that recruitment period elongated and still happening today. So we haven't yet seen the full recruitment results for the year to say definitively how we've done for this fall, that is. But, you know, for those where we're seeing what look to be solid numbers, I'd say that we've got a good number of our chapters, upwards of 40 or 50, who are doing better than they did last year. And again, in some of those cases, probably the best they've ever done. And I think they've done that by adopting that mentality of we're going to focus on it, and we're really going to get to know the individuals. And I think at a time where young men entering college, where they've been cooped up for 6 months, they missed out on some big experiences in high school, or their first 2 years of school in college. They're really looking for that belonging and that network. So I think that's been important. On the flip side, there are some chapters who've not done as well. There are some chapters who have not been able to adapt quite as well and have faced some challenges. So we're seeing it on both sides. Overall, it looks like we are holding pretty steady. We'll be off a little bit this year because of some other factors in terms of our new members that join us. But overall, chapter by chapter, there's a lot more doing better than not. Now, you also asked about expansion. That's a fascinating way to go about it, because in a normal expansion process, we send staff members out to spend 6, 7, 8 weeks on the ground and really recruit those men and help form that group. In today's world, that's just not possible. For one, we've put a hiatus on all staff travel just for the safety of our staff members, but also a lot of campuses aren't allowing visitors. So we have to think about it a different way. We did have 3 planned projects this fall, which they're being elongated as well. Our expansion team has taken some steps to recruit some interest and garner some of that interest this fall. But ultimately, we're not going to fully solidify those before the end of the year like we normally would. That'll kind of continue into next year. We hope to have some strong results then.
Yeah. When I was talking to some brothers and they were asking these questions, I said, I want to make sure we get Rob involved in this and be able to answer the questions. He knows what's going on. And really from the foundation standpoint, our role is to try to fund as much of those programs that we can fund for y'all. Knowing that even though that some of these are virtual classes, and we can still do alcohol education, we can still do leadership. There's still surveys that we can do. And so a lot of these activities just continue to go on. But I think the big key point for all of our graduate brothers to know is it doesn't look anything like it did a year ago, right? I mean, it has really just changed. And I think that's probably one of the other questions that I get from brothers is, so how within this time of social distancing and wearing masks, how are our house corporations functioning, and how are they doing what they're doing, knowing that they have to deal with this stuff on a daily basis? So can you share with us what you're seeing with house corporations and some of the challenges that they may be facing and overcoming?
Well, our house corporations are certainly busier than ever. And I think we owe them a lot of credit to the work that they've done to help get our chapters back up and running for the fall. I mean, a lot of them were put in that position where in the spring, they just suddenly had to close up shop and deal with how you close down the chapter house mid-semester.
Yeah.
Had to deal with a lot of issues with brothers looking for refunds on their housing and things like that, and putting some of them in a financial strain. I think you couple that then with the thought of how do we reopen. There is no two localities rather that are looking at this the exact same way. So you've got every house corporation really having to weigh a lot of different factors, and mostly on about what's happening locally. So it really has taken that local involvement to best understand what they need to do. In terms of how they're faring, overall, our house corporations are doing really well with this. And again, there's a lot of work going on to give them credit to with that. In a lot of cases, not all, but in a lot of cases, they had to come up with plans for how they're going to implement these new procedures, everything from cleaning to food service to occupancy. So many of them are limited in their occupancy. Maybe it's at 75%, 50%, depends on what the scenario is. And they also had to come up with plans to say, if someone does test positive, how do we safely quarantine them, right? So that's been significant for our house corporations. I think you couple that with some additional costs and all these things I'm talking about, it's created a little bit of a financial strain. It's definitely been straining some of the reserves that were in place. And in some cases, our house corporations had to ask for some help. And I think we should be very proud that in those cases, our graduate brothers, the brothers from those chapters, generally speaking, have responded very well and very quickly to help make sure that they can be financially stable, working through this and helping us ensure a bright future. We have had some chapters and some houses that have had some issues along the way. I stopped counting off the top of my head, at least, how many chapter houses were under a quarantine under one point in time or not. So I think they've been having to deal with those issues as well. And the good part is I think a lot of our house corporations have found a lot of support from our university partners, from the local health departments, and ultimately from the international fraternity, because it does take all of us to figure out the best path forward in all this.
Yeah. You said something that I hadn't even really thought about, but it just made a lot of sense when you said, that every chapter house corporation is having to open or to adjust or to close or to quarantine, all of them differently. And I mean, there are a few things you can advise them on that are the go-tos, right? But really after that, it's what's happening locally and what kind of restrictions that the school has on them. So it's a challenge. I am sure it is. At least a few conversations I've had with some house corporations, that's what I'm hearing. So I hadn't thought about how, we're talking about 90 different house corporations that have houses or something. So, so we also are hearing questions about, so we have, we've got 1,000 or so volunteers from Purple Legionnaires, section chiefs, boards of chapter advisors, and we've just talked about house corporations. So, how how are we really staying in communication with them, and what are some of the needs that we're seeing that they're having that the fraternity's needing to try to advise them on?
Sure. Well, yeah, I think the good news for our advisors is they've been in a lot of ways used to connecting from afar in some way, shape, or form. There's a lot of that advising that is in person, that is in place, but that's not all the time. So it's been more just rethinking the communication and probably having a lot more frequent communication. A lot of our Purple Legionnaires and BCA members maybe previously weren't used to things like Zoom or Google Hangouts or GroupMe chats, right? But they suddenly become very familiar and have learned how to use those things, because that's what they need to do to stay in touch with their chapter officers, with their major committee chairman, and help keep the chapter going as a whole. I think we've seen a great amount of support from those brothers who really do care, and we want to show them we care as well. So I think we've been opening up and have a lot more just open communication and frequent communication with our advisors to better understand what is it they're seeing. And I think what this has led to in a lot of ways, beyond advisors and in-house corporations, we're seeing a lot more of that open sharing of ideas and best practices and what everyone is finding that is working. So what works on one campus with one chapter may not work with every single one, but it certainly generates some ideas for some others. And I think that's been a great benefit as well.
You know, and the fraternity's always had a strong volunteer, group that, gets it done. And now more than ever, we've always said that graduate brothers are our continuity, and they're proving that, especially this year, just by what they're doing. So it's really nice to see that happening, and that you can confirm that. Another big question I hear is, the brothers ask a question, well, is the headquarters open? And so they're really asking two things. Are we open to visitors? But also, how are we operating in a time when we should be socially distancing and doing a lot of other things? So there are really two parts of that question. How are we open?
Well, the short answer is yes, we're open, but unfortunately not to visitors. I think out of respect to our staff and health and safety considerations, we had to make that decision to say that unfortunately it can only be the folks who work here that are permitted in the building. So we can't say for sure when brothers are going to be able to come back and visit the museum and the like and just say hello, but we certainly appreciate that they're asking. I think in terms of the staff as a whole, we've all had to learn to be flexible, right? When this all started back in March, we had to make some quick decisions as to how to best proceed. And so, one of those, maybe the position most impacted is the field secretary, for example. I think a lot of brothers who are watching this are probably familiar with that role. And that's a young man who's generally traveling 9 months a year. And now suddenly they can't be. It's not safe for them to do so. We've pulled them off the road. So this has generated a significant transition and transformation of our entire chapter services model. And I think overall it's been very beneficial. Instead of a field secretary having very significant contact, but very condensed over maybe a 3 or 4 day period while he's visiting a chapter, he's touching base with his chapter officers, his major committee members in any given chapter at least once or twice a week. And so I think you're seeing a lot more regular communication, a lot more regular support that's being offered. And I think our chapters overall seem to be appreciating that. Don't get me wrong. I think there's great benefit to seeing everybody in person, and when we can, we're going to be getting back to that in some way, shape, or form. But I think it's opening our eyes to some different ways of doing things. I think overall with the staff as a whole, it's also been a shuffle because we recognized right at the beginning that we had to identify the most important things for us to be doing right now to ensure stability and support for our chapters and our graduates, our volunteers. So we had to shuffle some things around, and some folks haven't been doing different things for the last 6 months, but that's where the need are, and our staff overall has responded very well. We got a lot of folks that are working here in the building, but we got a lot of folks that are working remotely as well. And we're giving our staff that flexibility to be able to do that, both to take care of their families and to ensure their own health and safety as well. And we're going to keep that up as long as we need to.
Yeah. And I think one of the things that you and I have talked about frequently is just the fact that it can get old, and we can be a little tired of all of it. But yeah, it is important for brothers to know that we're trying to, there are so many things that we do here that require people to be in. There's some things that require them to be away. And so far, I think we've done a good job of being able to get that done, even though people are kind of coming and going at different times. So I think y'all have done a great job with that. Almost everything we've talked about so far really has really related to what the COVID virus has done to us. But that is just one aspect. I mean, while it has been a huge aspect of what's going on in our lives for the last 8 months, there are a lot of other things that are happening in Phi Gamma Delta and the Greek world. And there might be some things you want to just update the brothers on about, other things that are, kind of that you and the Archons are kind of keeping your eye on, or at least talking about.
Absolutely. Well, Ben, I think you and I can agree that the fraternity has been blessed with great leadership over time, and today is no exception. This all happened during a very interesting period because it was right at the tail end of one term of the Arcanate and ultimately the beginning of another. So there was an interesting transition that happened there through the course of an interesting collegiate, which we won't get into right now. But ultimately, we have been blessed with that leadership and that understanding, that foresight to say we cannot do things normally. We can't just keep continuing everything else and assume we're going to keep up with all these new things on the side. So one of the things that the Archons have done is really given me the latitude to have some really significant focus on some key areas. So first and foremost is our COVID response, and we spend significant time on that every day to ensure the welfare of our chapters. But secondly, is one of the big things going on, and one of the big conversations, not just in the Greek world but societally, is around race and diversity, around racism, around inclusion, and equity. And certainly there's a lot of very tough conversations happening today on those topics. So that's been an area of focus for Phi Gamma Delta as we consider who we are, who we want to be, and who's a part of our membership. I think we want to be ultimately an organization, and I think we strive to be, and in a lot of ways we certainly are, an organization that is open and really values-based, not based on skin color or overall or beliefs otherwise. So there is a diversity, equity, and inclusion committee that has been formed, and that group is working hard to help us identify things we need to think about in today's world to open up Phi Gamma Delta even more in this area, so that we can ensure that we are not only diverse, but we're giving everybody the same opportunity in our organization. The other big thing, and it's an unfortunate thing where it has to be a focus, but we can't take our eyes off the ball on hazing. This was a big area that we've been tackling for a lot of years here, and had a lot of significant focus on hazing and hazing prevention in the last 2 years especially. So that continues to be a big focal area for us. Phi Gamma Delta lost about a dozen chapters to hazing over the past 2 years alone, and we continue to call that the #1 killer of fraternity chapters. So we continue to work hard, not only to send a message and a very strong message that we just don't tolerate hazing, and to get brothers to join our fight against hazing, but to also rethink those things that we need to rethink to have a better membership experience going forward. So we really think about that as really rethinking the entire joining process and giving our chapters better tools to have a better, have our newest members have a better experience there. Our efforts don't continue, or have not really diminished in our overall effort to build courageous leaders. That's another important piece. And you mentioned a little bit of that. We continue a lot of our educational programming, just in a different format. But if there's one thing that could help us the most, it is educating and empowering our brothers, all of our brothers, to take a stand for their values and take a stand for our values when it matters the most. So when they reach those testing points, when they're challenged, when they see something that's just not right, to stand up and say so and work to make a change. And that's one of the big areas for us. I think finally, the fifth area that we're really focused on pretty heavily, and then we've talked about this a little bit, is housing as an experience. I think we recognize that chapter houses aren't necessary for a successful chapter, but where there is housing involved, it is very important that it's done well and done right. So there's been an increased focus in the last couple of years on that housing experience, and I think especially with the challenges that our houses and house corporations have faced these past 6 months, it's important we keep up that effort and help them moving forward in a very productive way.
And in all of this, whenever your life's kind of come to a screeching halt, and as they did this spring, and since then we've had a chance to really think about that, and we've learned how to adapt and do things. But what are some things you think that we're learning as an organization? And I know, individually we can certainly talk about things that we're learning in the capacity of our jobs and how we do those jobs. But what do you think we're learning through all of this? What do you think will be some of the outcomes down the road, 5 months, 6 months, a year or two, that you're seeing?
Well, I think one of the big things we're gonna see in as an overarching thought It's that really the idea of those sacred cows is starting to go away. Yeah, this experience has opened our eyes to different ways of doing a lot of things. And so Phi Gamma Delta, not unlike other fraternities, we do a lot of things because that's what we've always done. This has really opened our eyes to change our thinking. So one of the biggest areas that's going to be impacted down the road, and I think where we've seen some great success, is what we talked about, right, in with undergraduate recruitment. I think that across the board, we're going to see some very significant changes to how recruitment is approached and how it's ultimately conducted. That's going to be very beneficial in the long run. These were changes that we've been talking about. And by changes, I really mean moving away from that big in-person rush mentality and really getting back to that basics of one-on-one recruiting. I think that's going to be a byproduct that is ultimately very beneficial for us down the line. I think we're rethinking our reliance on these big events, right? These big things that bring a lot of people together. And while we love them, I think a lot of chapters, especially and graduates, are seeing the benefit of doing things a little bit differently and just bringing smaller groups together and really broadening their reach by going virtual. So I think, if I had to predict when we get back to whatever normal is in the future, we're going to see technology play a big factor in that, even more so than it has. You're going to see a lot more opportunities for graduate brothers, especially, to be involved, even if they can't be in that same space. I think, overall, I think something I hope we're all learning through all this is we've all had challenges, as we've all had things that we've had to face. And when we stop and we just talk to each other for a few minutes, when we talk and we focus on our relationships with one another, and we talk to each other with a little bit of empathy and understanding, it goes a long way to understand where we are and what we need to do. So I think particularly those chapters who have had some of those tough conversations, not necessarily around COVID, but around diversity and equity and inclusion in today's political climate, as we've had some of those tough conversations, but we take a minute just to focus on where we all really are and what we care about. The outcome is a lot better. We see a lot of yelling at each other in today's world, and I think fraternity is a great place to really have those conversations that need to happen instead of just being drowned out by the loudest voice.
I'm watching our time, and we probably ought to think about closing. And I want to share something else that's kind of happening in Phi Gamma Delta that when we have a call like this, a lot of times we don't focus on, but to me, it continues to show the strength of our organization. Even though we have to socially distance and those kind of things, the fraternity is still presenting, recognition pieces to like our, Diamond Owl brothers who've been members of the fraternity for 75 years or more. And those are still being delivered, and those brothers are taking photographs of their certificate, or in one case that I'm thinking of, a brother and his sons and his grandchildren that are Phi Gams, and there must have been 7 or 8 brothers in that picture with him. So things like that are continuing to happen, that fraternity, and even, and sometimes even some golf tournaments are taking place, and some brothers that, are trying to come in together and figure out how to socially distance and do some things together as graduate brothers. Those things are still kind of happening. And I do want to share one thing, is that in 2020, we have had 5 of our graduate brothers who are 100 years or older make a gift to the fraternity or to the foundation. And so, and talking to one of those brothers, he said, well, he said, I just knew that y'all could use some help right now. And so it's just amazing to watch the fraternal side of what we all know fraternal life can be, is that support, and that, supporting each other, loving each other, and taking care of each other. And that friendship is sweetest influence. And again, I'm going to quote Calvin Coolidge for us. It's the last sentence of the persistence quote, and that is the slogan: "Press on has solved and always will solve the problems of the human race." And so, Rob, one, I want to thank you for the time today to sit down and talk about this. But I think the ultimate message is, hey, look, keep our nose to the grindstone. We're going to continue to try to solve problems, and we might goof up a few things, but ultimately we're going to get there. And it's because our undergraduates and our graduate base are committed, and they're strong, and they want to see success, right? I mean, they want us to see this thing work out. And so I'm very optimistic about that, even though I know it's going to be a little bumpy. But y'all have done a great job, Rob, and keep it up. We'll hopefully be doing another one of these maybe in January or something to update everybody. But brothers, we want to thank you. Obviously, if you have a question about anything that we've talked about, you may contact Rob or Ben through email or call in the headquarters. You can still pick up the phone if you'd like. So we want to thank you for your time. Rob, thank you for you. Anything else you want to share right before we leave?
No, I appreciate it, Ben. Appreciate the opportunity to talk with our brothers today. And brothers, I appreciate your continued support. It is significant, it is important, and it is needed. So we appreciate your continued support of Phi Gamma Delta.
Pair Gay brothers.
Thank you.